Hello and welcome to Being Crisis Prepared, the BCP podcast from Inveroy Crisis Management. Today I am delighted to be joined by Dee O'Leary, oil and gas executive with decades of experience at the sharp end of dealing with crises in all its various guises. I won't steal Dee's thunder by doing her full background, but Dee, great of you to join us and give up your time today. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you very much, Matthew. So, Deirdre O'Leary, everyone calls me Dee. I grew up in Canada with three brothers and a family that moved around a lot and spent all my summers fly fishing in the backwoods of Newfoundland. So for those of you who aren't aware, that's close to where the Titanic sank. So that's what got me in the mind frame of joining the oil industry. I was in the mindset of wanting an adventurous and international career, which I did achieve starting in 1998. I worked for a super major for 18 years, and I just totted up this morning that includes 18 different countries if you count the places that I've lived and spent significant amounts of time. So I started off oil exploration in the North Sea in 1998 when the price was $10 a barrel. So indeed, no stranger to crises. And then I moved on through various technical and commercial roles into business development in the Middle East. And then 4 years ago, I changed gears. I now work for a mid-cap company as an asset manager. And we're focused on the Kurdistan region of Iraq for both exploration and production.
Okay, thank you very much for that overview. And it always amazes me. I, as some listeners will know, spent nearly 30 years in the British Army, and I thought I moved around a bit. But I didn't manage, I don't think, 18 countries. And the thing that always strikes me with the oil and gas industry is that you go to places that are either climate challenged or you are producing a commodity that has value, and therefore people are trying to take it off you, whether it's piracy or local insurgents. There is always something going on that adds risk to the business, let alone the fact that you're producing hydrocarbons that, as we all sadly remember from whether it be Piper Alpha in the UK continental shelf, or perhaps more recently, everyone remembers Macondo in the Gulf of Mexico. When things go wrong in your industry, they go catastrophically wrong, and therefore your regulations and so on are always top level. So it's great that you're able to join us, and your awareness of crises. I hope we will be able to pull out some really good observations for our listeners as we go through, both for the oil and gas sector that people may be familiar with, but using that as a tool to draw out lessons perhaps that are more widely applicable as well, that people can reflect on. Dee, I asked you a couple of questions before we started, just so that we had a running order. And the first one that we were going to look at was this idea of the international workforce. And the oil and gas industry has relied on the model of moving to a location and using what we would call the expat community or teams to start and training up local workforce. But that then leaves issues with lots of international workforce traveling inwards and outwards. And obviously COVID has then come along and I assume has challenged that model. Can you talk us through how you've both seen it, if you're able to, from your personal experience, but also perhaps from a regional perspective? Obviously, you've got lots of colleagues, lots of networks that you might be able to discuss.
Sure. So I think from that perspective, Kurdistan is a very good place to start. So the company that I'm working for is the largest operator in Kurdistan. We've been operating there for the past 14 years. And from that viewpoint, we have been lucky in that we've managed to grow and attract a cadre of local, national workers who have enabled us to become for that to become our flagship area. And I'll give you one example. It's not normally very fashionable or normal these days for international oil companies to own their own rigs, but we do. And we have one rig, for example, which is manned almost 100% by Kurdish workers.
Wow.
Which has an impeccable safety record. I think it's been literally years. I think they recently passed 5 years without any incidents. So yes, exactly. So
sorry for our listeners there. I was touching my head to represent touching wood because
exactly.
that sounds like too good that we don't want to.
I'll do it.
I'll cross fingers, I'll smear myself over wood rather than just touch it. I've got a wooden desk.
Exactly.
No, what a great record and testament to the skills of the local workforce. That but for our non-oil and gas listeners, a rig is the bit that moves around the site. Correct me where I get this wrong. And is targeted for the drilling of and therefore lots of heavy machinery, lots of moving parts, lots of potential for serious injury. And therefore to have no injuries is a great testament to the skill of that crew. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's got all the risks. It's got working at height. It's got the volatile hydrocarbons, dropped objects, all of every sort of safety hazard that you can think of, it's possible to find on a rig. So with that being said, that particular rig is not an enormously powerful rig. So like most people, we contract other rigs for our drilling programs. And we do, of course, therefore have this hybrid of international and local model for the drilling rigs themselves, but also all of the services that come along with the drilling rigs. So you need fluids, you need to measure the rocks and the oil and gas properties that you're finding, and so on. So we do have that model, and we have been challenged by this current situation we find ourselves in, which is COVID plus low oil prices. So in March, my company made an announcement. So it's in the public domain that, like everybody else, we were reducing discretionary spending. So that meant drilling, that meant projects, and that also meant staff. So on top of that, as you recall, back in March, the Iraqi authorities put a travel ban on people from different countries, people traveling from different countries, including Europe. All normal commercial flights were canceled. So it became a crisis on top of a crisis, on top of a headache. And then
presumably there's none of those levers that you can influence because that's government imposed that you have to respond to. You can't open your own airport, for example.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we had to operate in a different way, relying obviously heavily on the local national staff. And then, of course, we have a couple of other levers. So the government does approve some charter flights from time to time. So there is that option. And then, of course, there is this, I think recently, very much more highly used technology of video conferencing, which we can talk about. So remote working. So with that combination, I can say that the company has been remarkably resilient. So also in the public domain, we made recently an announcement that on our flagship license, we've actually increased production from month on month from 100,000 barrels per day to 115,000 barrels per day.
Wow. Which even my maths, I can work out 15% is a big
exactly.
difference.
It's very convenient.
Thank you very much. But And I think for the listener to that story is the impact that we're discussing there, the complex. The barrel price of oil has stabilized now at around $43 a barrel, but had dropped down to, well, some reports almost negative, but probably 17, 18-ish from a figure of 65, but 10 years ago, a figure of 120. So when you're making the investment decisions on, is this project going to be profitable? Well, at 120, absolutely. At 17, now we're in a different world of hurt. So there's crisis number one, and we weathered that. Crisis number two is the whole saga of just operating in Kurdistan. It's a landlocked country or region within Iraq. It's very hot in the summer. It's cold and snowy where you are, I think, in the winter.
Very much so.
So you've got all the sort of natural challenges. You've got fluctuating market challenges. You've got the legacy issues of COVID and refugees from Syria coming across. Sorry, COVID, ISIS and the refugee sort of movement that still, 5-6 years later, is still there as a legacy issue. Oh yeah, and Baghdad and the arguments that are going on with them of who does the oil belong to. And then you chuck in, the workforce that you've been relying on as your historical model, the expats coming in to do that more challenged drilling and perhaps the oversight, they now can't come in. So it's crisis on top of crisis on top of crisis. And I always think in Kurdistan that perhaps similar with many other areas in the oil and gas industry that can be chosen, you are so used to what I would think many businesses would regard as a crisis that for you it's just normal daily work. It's a challenge. It's another punch that's come your way, but it's not floored you, and you get on with it. Is that sort of fair for your experience of Kurdistan?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So very much so. So the achievements that I just mentioned on drilling, so those were carried out completely safely and very very high margin of increases. Mm-hmm. Due to the mentality and the discipline and the hard work and dedication of the people on the ground.
Yeah.
On top of some innovative approaches. So I can talk about that from the viewpoint of my company, because we have also recently commissioned a major gas project. So some of the listeners may know about enhanced oil recovery. This is a phase of oil field production which you investigate once the field becomes a little bit more mature. You have to inject water or gas into it to keep the pressure up, to keep the production flowing.
Okay, yep.
But all of your listeners will be familiar with this impetus to get flares down.
Yeah, yeah.
So
the
all
whole
over
climate
the
change
world,
issue of
the whole climate change issue, the greenhouse gases, the CO2. So this is really, so what we've done is we commissioned recently the first EOR project in Kurdistan, which is very fantastic, with all of the construction of facilities and of the pipelines and everything that was required. So how is this done? How is it possible to do final acceptance testing and commissioning of facilities when until this point, I would say in sort of industrial history, the paradigm was that the key people have to be there on the ground to make sure that that this is squared away properly. And what we've seen and achieved in my company, and also if I take the broader Iraqi perspective, if you look at some of the ongoing projects that are going on in the south of Iraq with the Basra Gas Company and so on, it is remarkable how much has been achieved in this realm of facilities both upgrading new facilities and pipeline projects.
And I think
I can talk a little bit about how they how that's been achieved operationally.
I think from people are the core of everything when it comes to business, and the typical business continuity sort of comment of, do you have a plan for loss of ... Loss of people is always the one that's at the top of that list of, how do you balance, what happens if a key person gets poached by a competitor, or your away day in a minibus have a road traffic accident and several of them are in hospital. That's easy to do in an exercise. You've been faced with it for, we still got the people, but they're in the wrong place. They're in,
yes.
Whether it be Aberdeen or Houston or wherever they may be, sat at home, and to get them to the right place, yes, you could charter a flight and fly them in, but they've then got to sit in a hotel in Erbil for 2 weeks in quarantine, and they've got lots more restrictive movement, etc. So it's just slow at best. And so, that succession planning of how you've overcome that loss of people scenario would be great to hear your story.
So I think so that's a great run-in to the topic, which is affecting oil and gas companies all over the world. I think it's really it's very interesting to focus on the broader Iraq for this. So, for example, if you look at South Iraq, because something that we were talking about before the podcast started was this concept of, okay, we have the 1-2 punch of COVID and low oil prices, but that doesn't stop, or maybe that also starts a snowball effect of many crises amplifying each other. So if you look at southern Iraq at this time of year, you always have protests. And that's because there's not, for legacy reasons, there's not enough electricity for people. They need their air conditioning. They need to be able to, travel around to do their work and survive. And it's very difficult at this time of year. And what exacerbates the situation is, if you've ever flown over Iraq and you look down, it's like a reverse constellation when you see the flares. But it's a reverse constellation of horror, really, because what you're looking at is all of those 1 million standard cubic feet of gas being burned when people in Iraq need those molecules for their security of supply. So if you look at a company like Basra Gas, that's been in the public domain recently with extra problems with their personnel, because due to the low oil price, their salaries are not being paid by the government. And so you actually, at the time when they need their local national staff the most, they're not really surviving or being paid. And so they're protesting. So it's really a perfect storm of problems for people. But nevertheless, until now, they're managing to get their work done largely, as I explained. I think if I reflect on what you said about people not being at the right place at the right time, the only thing I would add to that is that there is an enormous amount of increased wear and tear on people. Yep. So what you have is you have entire teams, so leadership teams, contracting teams who are working remotely from Iraq. So they're simply not there anymore. The crews that are on the ground, they are stuck there for much longer periods of time due to the travel restrictions and the work requirements, quarantine restrictions. So if you have to come in and go into quarantine for 2 weeks, well, then that immediately is tagging a lot of time and a lot of wear and tear onto your hitch. And so the way that one of the key measures that have allowed the oil and gas industry to keep on drilling, keep on moving, has been increased communication between the people who are on the ground and their teams and their leaders who are working remotely. Of course, this is now a lot more time consuming than it ever was. So you have daily meetings where you have to go into much more detail about the activities that the people need to perform. Plus, you've got much more frequent meetings with very senior management. So decision makers have to be in these calls every week or more often to deal with the sort of trade-offs and decisions that people need to make every day. So I would say until now, I mean, we're looking now at almost 5 months in this sort of mode. And people are very grateful for their jobs and their health when they have it, and that contributes, I think, to the motivation they have to keep going. But something to look out for, obviously, is that one of the differences for this crisis compared to other ones we faced is how long is it going to last?
Yeah, and I think. Again, we discussed before we started recording the podcast, the idea of, in the First World War, we came across the idea of battle fatigue or shell shock as it became known. And that everyone thinking militarily has a level of courage, a bank of courage, if you like. And over time, when you're faced with daily assaults to that level in your account starts to wear down. And you get to the level that, hang on a second, I'm now in deficit, and shell shock starts to take effect. And it just strikes me that if we take that model and look at it from, transpose it onto the oil and gas industry, the bank of goodwill, if you like, rather than the bank of courage, you built up that bank, you're in credit because, there's good terms and conditions and the food is good and, camaraderie that you work to improve and share options, or everything that a good company puts in place to attract and retain the top quality people. Okay, so now you've got 8, 10, 12-week rotations, 90-day rotations instead of 28-day rotations. You've got the extra stresses, the longer hours, etc. At what point? And clearly you represent, you are working with a top quality company that I'm sure has many good things in place. But for the rest of our listeners, it's that, how are my team doing? Yes, we talk on Zoom every day or whatever it might be, Teams. But is that really the same? Are they just tired? And it's very difficult to judge that when you aren't, the water cooler moment, when you can't physically go and be with them and sit and have lunch and gauge it, because I often think you can hide quite a lot on a Zoom call.
Yes.
The stresses of the rest of your life, if you like. No, I think that there are many businesses that are teetering on that edge. And for the wider community in the UK, we've got the government-backed furlough scheme that has been great, absolutely great. But now there's a them and us of half the population can't wait to get back to work, a bit less than half, 30%, because they've been furloughed. So they've saved lots of money because they can't spend it, and they've been paid 80% pay by the government. Fantastic. But the rest, hang on a second, okay, I'm on 100%, but I've been working, and I've been working really hard. And where's my 4 months off to go and spend time with my children or whatever? And so there is a world, I think, of HR people issues from a crisis or business continuity perspective that we don't normally get to face. Normally it's, you've got your terms and conditions, I love you lots, you'll get a bonus, but and we leave it at that. We don't perhaps think the second order of, what can I do to recharge that bank of goodwill? Is it, do you know what? I just think you're doing a fantastic job. Here's a meal voucher, or you've worked through your wedding anniversary or your son or daughter's 18th birthday, or whatever it might be. Here's a little something just to say thank you. And those little things, just even thank you is, well, the boss recognizes that I'm going above and beyond. And
Yeah.
we can't all give bonuses because we're fighting COVID, you're fighting COVID and low oil price. What else can we do? And wouldn't it be great if we could all wave a magic wand and these things go away? But I do think we need to recharge that bank of goodwill before we go into deficit, because when the next crisis hits, and yes, COVID is the massive crisis of the moment, but you talk there of the 1, 2, and potentially 3 and 4.
Yes.
When the 4th and 5th come along, people are just going to be, do you know what? I've had enough. I'm out of here. I'm going to go and drive trucks for local supermarket, or because I can't be doing with it anymore. It's too stressful. And then that is a disaster. And
it's what if I could summarize that,
please do.
it seems like there is just a bow wave building up where people are they're doing everything they can at the moment to stay on track. But as you say, that stress is cumulative.
Yeah.
And if I reflect on my whole career, so prior to the company that I'm working for now, when I was working for a super major, I've seen this play out, not in as bad crises as these, but also crises, and I've seen it work well and not well. So I think first of all, it's a question of leadership. So for example, when I was working in Qatar in 2006, in 2007, on the Pearl Gas to Liquids project, which was a mega project, $25 billion mega project,
okay,
which is it's the only project of its kind in the world. It has very good green credentials because it uses old, actually, Second World War technology, catalyst technology, to turn gas molecules into liquid at room temperature and pressure.
Okay.
So you can imagine that you can, it's fantastic because gas is obviously a great fuel when it comes to emissions. And if you can waft gas over catalysts and turn it into liquid, that's just fantastic. Why aren't we doing this in the world at large scale? It's because you need enormous economies of scale to get it to work.
Okay.
So what we had, if you can imagine, in Qatar, was the requirement to build a plant which would require a workforce of 50,000 people. Can you imagine 50,000 laborers? So that's not a camp anymore. That is a city.
Yeah.
And so before that, obviously, lots of studies were done, and the one which caused a big kerfluffle was non-accidental death. So the predictions was that those numbers were going to be very high, that there were going to be a lot of tensions. There were people coming from all over the world. Some of them had never worn safety boots before. There were dozens of different languages being spoken. And it was a crisis waiting to happen. At the same time, if you remember back in 2006, 2007 days, we had the opposite problem in the oil and gas market, that it was vastly overheating. And so the supply chain was very hot. Steel was incredibly expensive. So discretionary budgets all over the world were at an all-time low. So how do you balance this need to make sure that you have care for people at the time when you don't have a lot of money to address it? And what Shell did at the time was absolutely fantastic. They started from the inside out, so asking the people, finding out what it would take to make them feel better about the circumstances that they were in. And sometimes it boiled down to, as you can imagine, infrastructure, so places for them to go, socially, sports, and so on. But the real remarkable ones were the ones that allowed them to connect with home.
Yeah.
So calling home, phone cards, also small things like meals from home. This was really a game changer, and the project was really a big success. Now, on the other side of the coin, I was working. I'm mainly a technical person. I advanced later into more commercial roles, but I did do at one point a side posting into petroleum economics, and that was just a spreadsheet hell, as you can imagine. Very difficult, a lot of spreadsheets, 14 hours a day. And unfortunately, it was one of those roles where in most of your jobs, you know, if you're 80, 20, or 90% or 99% finished, you can go ahead. There are laws of diminishing returns and, you know, the pitfalls of perfectionism. You need to execute. But unfortunately, this was one of those roles where your model had to be perfect and converged before, you know, it was very binary. It was zero or nothing. And so that was a very stressful time. And on a team of 12, which were spread out all over Europe at the time, 2 people went off with a very serious burnout to the point where they couldn't return for 6 months. So a team came in and studied us to find out what was the difference between people who could, you know, keep going like this for many years and people who could not. And they found out, and it's so important these days, that the deciding factor was isolation.
Okay.
So the people that felt the most isolated were the ones that their stress was manifesting itself with real long-term problems, like with burnout and so on. And so that is one learning which has come back to me during this time as very important. So it's that leadership visibility, and also making sure that people are not isolated.
And I think the burnout and isolation piece is, as you read the news and different stories, and you can just pick up that from a UK perspective at the moment, everyone's talking about getting back to work, and the head of Barclays Bank released yesterday, which is, you know, we're at the end of July at the moment, the idea that he wants his people to go back to work, despite the fact that it would be much cheaper if they could get rid of central London offices and so on. But he has recognized that, you know, the single person in a flat in the center of London, working from a laptop balanced on your knee, sat in on your bed or on the, at the kitchen table, is no way to run a business, because the whole, as you say, the stresses of doing it, and both the physical and mental risks involved. And we are ultimately, as humans, we are pack animals, and that ability to, the pleasure of the unexpected bumping into someone in the corridor and having a 2-minute chat about something just breaks up the day. But equally important, if you're sharing an office, you pick up things that just mean that you are able to sidestep issues that bit quicker, rather than having to rely on a Zoom call with 15 other colleagues that you may miss that piece of the jigsaw that solves your issue, that allows you to get to sleep at the right time. Yeah. No, I think that whole area is perhaps one to watch for all our listeners. But I am conscious that time is marching on, and we will suddenly be a podcast and a half if we're not careful. But one of the things that I really want to just perhaps finish on, if I may, is the idea. I know that you are a very keen fitness person. Let's leave it at that for now. And you can and it chimes with something that I've spoken about in the past, about the importance of sport as a tool to learn from, not just about how do you play soccer or how do you go swim, but the preparation that gives you for being a crisis management professional or a senior leader with crisis responsibility. Can you give us a couple of thoughts on that line, just as we come towards the end of the podcast, on your experiences or your observations?
Yes. So I think the biggest parallel that I have is an expedition that I did in 2018. So in 2018, I walked across the empty quarter in Saudi Arabia. So people may have heard of that. It was made a little bit famous in expedition circles by Wilfred Thesiger, who crossed it in 1946. But he crossed it with camels.
He was sensible. That seems to be, sorry, if crossing it at all is sensible, at least he. So you on foot.
Yes, on foot. So, and then the other thing that he and most empty quarter, or Rub Khali in Arabic, most people cross it by circumventing the dunes. But my training partner and I, another Canadian, we chose to go straight from south to north, right, crossing perpendicular across the highest dunes for 300 kilometers. That took us 10 days. We had obviously no Wi-Fi or cell phone coverage, and I would say the biggest learning that we had from that, or that I had from that, is it took us years to prepare. It took us 2 years to prepare, really. We used to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning every weekend and go running in the desert, practicing. I think most people who are even semi-fit could have done the work, but it's the small things that become enormous things, like getting a blister, which could get infected, could be a game changer. It could end your whole expedition. So how do you solve that? What sort of gear do you use? And I'll give you an example of that. On the first morning, before we started running, we spent literally 1 hour taping up our feet and covering it with tincture of benzoate to make sure that the tape stuck on.
Yep.
And we had a crew of 4 Saudi guys that we had hired to carry the gear. So, for example, we needed 900 liters of water. We needed 1,400 liters of petrol. So it was quite there was quite a lot of supply chain and logistics involved as well. But I remember these 4 guys looking at us on the first morning, and myself and my training partner, who's also a Canuck, taking an hour just to, fix our feet before we had even run one step. And you could tell that they thought that we were in for a
long
failure.
10 days for them.
Long 10 days.
Yeah, but it's a classic example of a story that highlights what is so many different health and safety or risk models, the bow tie that of controls and mitigating actions and so on. Yep, you put all the controls in place so you don't have the event that then means that you don't have to. No, I can't call the emergency services to come and get me because I don't have Wi-Fi. So any evacuation from the middle of the empty quarter is going to take days.
Yes,
precisely. So all those issues just brings to light that through an adventure like you've described, that go no go decision making, what's the right time, when do we do it, all the before, and then that thinking, what if, ... and it's not a cost benefit analysis, it's a life benefit analysis of if I get this wrong, this is going to really hurt. And then on the right hand side of the bow tie of what do we do when it does go wrong, heaven forbid.
Exactly.
Actually, that side's quite empty. I don't have much on that side, so better make sure the left hand side is pretty good. So what a great example of we can use sport for so many different things. And for my sins, I like running. There we go. I've admitted it. I'm a runner, albeit getting much slower as I get older. And time again, you have to go through training at the moment for long distance. I get to point X. I've got no energy left. I've run out of water. I'm feeling rather sorry for myself. What am I going to do? Am I going to sit on the side of the road and gently sob? Or am I going to do something? Pack of jelly babies, right? That'll be the answer. That gives me the lift to get to the next stage. Am I just going to grit it out and get on with it? Well, if you've thought that through, you're mentally prepared. You will be better prepared for hopefully it not happening in the first place because you put the mitigation in place. But if it does, okay, I'm now just carrying out something I've mentally rehearsed rather than I've also got the shock of, blimey, where did that come from? And if you like, that's perhaps a difference between an emergency response and a crisis. An emergency being something you've thought through, you've developed a flow chart sort of plan, and you're able to say, right, at the start we do this, we call the emergency services, we get the medic on site, we put out the fire, we save lives, For crisis, scale, complexity, etc., is, you know what, we didn't expect this, and therefore we're not prepared. And when you're doing your empty quarter route, to be faced with a crisis would have been challenging.
It would have been challenging, and I think there was really a good symbiosis with the oil industry and this expedition. And so my training partner is also in the oil business, and so we could use shorthand like the bow tie model, and so on. I think so. There is a lot of synergies. The one big difference is that the empty quarter expedition we paid for ourselves. So when we made the decision to go with one of these international SOS companies to pull us out, and we were looking at how long would it take, I think we managed to get it down to 48 hours in the end. But when it's your money that's on the line, when you're making these trade-offs, then it puts everything really into a much sharper relief.
Yeah, and again, a great training for you for then business later on is that, yes, it's the companies or the shareholders' money that you're now dealing with, but you've got the rigor to do the same type of approach to say, hang on a second, is that best value for money? If it was my money, would I be happy with that expenditure? Because you've been there with your money to back your project. And so I just think sport, and thank you for that example, is such a good tool to bring it to life. And as I say, it doesn't matter whether you're a soccer player, a rugby player, whatever it is, there is an example there that says, what was the quote? Fail to prepare, prepare to fail. All these great things, and they're great because they're true. So thank you for that, and Dee, thank you for what I think is probably about 40 minutes of your time on the call this afternoon. Grateful you're calling in from Dubai, where I understand you're going through a heat wave there at the moment.
We are, and but it's the second Eid period, so there's festivities this weekend, and wishing everybody Eid Mubarak who's celebrating.
Yeah, and it's also Thursday that we're recording. So although I guess it's a long weekend, but it is your weekend, so coming up. So thank you very much indeed for your time, your knowledge that you shared. And I hope our listeners have enjoyed it. And I've certainly learned a lot from talking with you. And I hope that we meet again somewhere in Kurdistan, Erbil, wherever it may be. But no, I owe you a coffee at least for your time today. Thank you.
Well, I will invite you to the next cross empty quarter expedition.
Oh, that might be an offer I can refuse. No, look forward to it, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew.